Hello everyone. Today we'll be discussing the 1930 repatriation of Mexicans from Colorado. To begin with, I'd like to give some context to this topic. It's important to note that American society around this time relied heavily on food production. Food industries were the main driving force of the US economy. Crops such as sugar beets, tobacco, and cotton were especially profitable to produce. The main good produced in Colorado around this time was sugar derived from the harvesting of sugar beets. The interesting thing about sugar beets, however, was that they were a very difficult crop to harvest and relied heavily on family labor. Some historians state that in an ordinary farming family, a man would work 9 acres, a woman 7 acres, and children work in proportion to their age. Coupled with this fact and the difficult nature of this work, sugar beet harvesting was hardly produced by many Americans, especially those in Colorado. Now, you may be wondering why this counts as important context to the repatriation of Mexicans. So, what's the point of all this? The point is, since the supply of labor for sugar beet harvesting was low, many sugar producing companies sponsored propaganda that said that Mexicans were especially well suited for sugar beet cultivation and harvest. The result of this was that Mexican American and Mexican families were pushed into this segment of labor and eventually formed about two-thirds of all sugar beet harvesters in Colorado. Now, it's important to note that the contracts that these families signed with the sugar companies were far from fair. All the conditions of the work were determined solely by the companies. Historians also highlight that the contracts did not state exactly when the work season ended, and they didn't even provide a guarantee that the labor would receive pay after the work was completed. Why then did most of these families accept such atrocious conditions? Well, there are many answers to this question, but the most simplistic answer is that these families did not have better conditions to turn to. What is even more interesting about this system of employment is that historians have described it as a system of peonage, under which the Latino workers started out being indebted to the sugar company and had to work to reduce the amount of debt accounted to them in the next working season. So even if workers changed their minds and did not want to come back to work, they could not, since they were indebted to these large companies. Some families, having recognized this endless cycle of debt, sought help from private charities and public agencies in other towns in Colorado, such as Denver, Pueblo, and other smaller towns. So at this point, we've learned a little bit about what Colorado was like before the 1930s. We've also attempted to explain why Colorado had so many Mexican American and Mexican laborers during this time. Now we'll attempt to answer the question of the reason for the deportation of these laborers whose work was integral to the economic growth of the sugar industry in America. It's important to note that the critics of Mexican immigration, and more specifically Mexican labor, always existed. The likes of these included the then governor of Colorado, E.D. Johnson, pictured in the bottom right, who made it a point to solve the problem of the Mexican menace from the beginning of his tenure. His efforts seemed to get support among many white Americans in Colorado, but his efforts did not achieve any large-scale effects until the Great Depression. The Great Depression was the one event that single-handedly intensified the problem of the Mexican menace. The Great Depression brought so much lack of resources and lack of employment that it pitted the Mexican American and Mexican workers in direct competition with white Americans, not just for employment, but also for relief funds provided by private charities and public agencies. Due to this severe lack of resources, people held a common view that the government was obligated to secure employment for citizens over immigrants. This led to efforts to deport Mexicans back to Mexico in order to quote unquote free up space for white laborers. Now we'll look at how these deportations were conducted in order to determine whether the lack of resources was the only reason they were carried out. So here are a bunch of quotes from E.D. Johnson and supporters. The first one says, "Hundreds of Mexicans are holding jobs which should be held by American citizens. Many of these Mexicans are employed during the crop season in the beet fields." The second one says, "You are to be highly commended in your efforts to keep aliens out of this state. Japs are infinitely better." This was by a Johnson supporter. And on and on. We can read the last quote, which says, warning all Mexican and other aliens to leave the state of Colorado at once, by order of Colorado State Vigilance, which was also by Johnson's supporter. These quotes by people in Colorado who supported the deportation of Mexican labor give us a sentiment of what the atmosphere could have been like. We get to see how hostile Johnson supporters sounded towards immigrant labor. Even more importantly, we should realize that most of these arguments were not necessarily against Mexican immigrants alone, but against anyone who looked Mexican, including Mexican Americans who, according to the law, had equal rights to white Americans. To delve more deeply into this, we shall shortly examine the story of Sheriff Ray Marty, who was personally asked by Governor Johnson to halt alien Mexicans en route to the beet fields. In his effort to follow orders, Sheriff Marty detained about 32 Latino men, women, and children who were on their way to the sugar beet fields of northeastern Colorado. Funny enough, out of these 32 people, 20 of them were US citizens and at least 2 of them were seeking work. Furthermore, in Sheriff Marty's own opinion, it was practically impossible to know whether the papers of these detainees were original or not. What does this tell us about the nature of the 1930 deportations? Well, it shows us that the forced removal of people from the state of Colorado was not simply an economic decision made by state authorities. It was also a racial decision. Anyone who looked Mexican was detained until it was proven that they had appropriate papers. This, we have just learned, was almost impossible to prove, and hence, most Mexican Americans were wrongly included in the mass deportations. Narratives around how the deportations happened differ slightly, as we see from the following quotes. The first quote is a quote from a newspaper in the time period. It says, 4 truckloads of Mexicans, including men, women, and children, from Larimer County, passed through Longmont on their way to Denver Tuesday, the first of an exodus to their native land, Mexico. Only persons who volunteer to leave are allowed to go. The second is a quote from Emma Gomez Martinez, who gave a personal account of the deportations, and there's more info on the primary sources slide, which will be at the end of this video. It says, I witnessed police escorting Mexican families out of Longmont in a caravan. The police would stop occasionally and grab any Mexican-looking individual and throw them onto one of the trucks if they lacked identification. Later in life, when I recalled that incident, I realized the police weren't distinguishing between citizen and non-citizen. If you were Mexican, you were gone. We see that even though some newspaper accounts publicized the deportations as voluntary, these deportations were influenced by the racial discrimination against Mexicans in Colorado, coupled with the economic crisis of the Great Depression. So where do we find ourselves now? Well, through our analysis of the mass deportation of Mexicans in the 1930s, we've been able to uncover some otherwise hidden motives for these deportations. We've learned that although the deportations were pushed for as a result of the economic struggle of the Great Depression, there were also other motives at play. These motives existed long before the Great Depression and were actualized under the guise of helping Americans secure employment. What were these other motives? In my opinion, it was racism against a group of people who, on one hand, the state needed to help run its economy, and on the other hand, the state demonized as being leeches on its economy. In the words of the supporters of the deportations, they were only trying to solve the problem of the Mexican menace. Thank you for your attention.